Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight at Housing Works. I'm Elizabeth Goldstein. I'm the president of the Municipal Art Society, and we're really thrilled to have you here at Housing Works, who's been a fabulous partner with us doing this book series. And we're particularly excited about this evening because Ross Perlin's book about language and language in New York City is very consistent with a project that we've just begun to work on, and so it makes me very excited to hear this discussion that we're all going to share tonight. We're working on a project called the Enduring Culture Initiative, which is focused on what makes New York City and gives it its unique character. The Enduring Culture Initiative is a multi-year project to catalyze an evolution in the field of historic preservation, centering community-led efforts for elevating diverse histories and culture. A sense of place involves the many layers of things: histories, narratives, cultural traditions and practices, as well as community anchors like legacy businesses, public artworks, and urban gardens. These layers are intimately related to the way communities define themselves, but often lack protection and acknowledgement. And speaking of preservation and acknowledgement, let's dive in. It's my honor to introduce our two speakers this evening, Ross Perlin and this evening's moderator, Jordan Salama. Ross Perlin is a linguist, writer, translator focused on exploring and supporting the linguistic diversity. His book, Language City: The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, just came out from Grove. You all know that because that's why you're here. Since 2013, he's been the co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, managing research projects on map making, documentation policy, and public programming for urban linguistic diversity. He also teaches linguistics at Columbia, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, and elsewhere, and his first book, Internation: How to Earn Nothing and Learn Little in the Brave New Economy, ignited a national conversation about unpaid work. Jordan Salama is the author of Stranger in the Desert, an intergenerational family story that chronicles a journey across Argentina in search of traces of his Syrian Jewish great-grandfather, a traveling salesman in the Andes. His stories about culture and immigration in the Americas have appeared in the National Geographic, New York Magazine, the New York Times, and other national and international publications. He's also the author of Every Day the River Changes, a river journey through Columbia, which was named by Kirkus Review's Best Book of 2021 and the pre-read at Princeton University, where he graduated. He is based in recent years both here and in Buenos Aires, not such bad cities to commute between. The format this evening is very straightforward. Ross is going to introduce the book briefly, then they will engage in a conversation, which promises to be wonderful, and then they're going to welcome questions from you. Following the program, we encourage you to stick around and mix and mingle, plus you'll be able to purchase the book and have it signed if you'd like to do that. And without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me, it's not too echoey. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you to the two Genevieves and to both Housing Works and the Municipal Art Society for hosting us. It's wonderful to do this with two classic New York City institutions that have done so much for the city in a variety of ways. And thank you guys for coming out as well on a Wednesday evening. And to Jordan as well, I'm really excited for this conversation. Jordan and I are kind of, I don't know if there's a word for it exactly yet, but our books came out on almost the exact same date, so it's kind of like being birthday mates or something like that, or having the same sign. Check it out, Stranger in the Desert. It's enthralling. It's great writing about place, mobility, history, language. So I think we'll have a great discussion here, and I'm excited also for questions and to hang out and to sign books and to talk more with you about all of this. I thought I would start just by, for a couple of minutes, very briefly trying to get to sort of the gist of the book and where it's coming from and what it's talking about, and then we'll sort of go into more specific questions together. We're sitting in the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. And People will ask about London, Los Angeles, Johannesburg, Jakarta, and so on. And there's tremendous linguistic diversity everywhere in the world's cities, and never more so than today. But we've been documenting it here in New York for the last decade or so at the Endangered Language Alliance. This book is the product of that work. The mapping work is also available publicly. You can check out languagemap.nyc, our New York language map. That's the digital version. There's also a print version. We've substantiated the presence here of over 700 different languages, which is something like 10% of the world's total, and that almost certainly is just a sort of snapshot of Babel, of this ultimate Babel, really, that is New York, and that I trace the history of through the book. I haven't seen a linguistic portrait of any city up to this point. This is something that I was just talking about with Elizabeth. The linguistic infrastructure of cities, the linguistic and cultural infrastructure of cities is perhaps its least visible but most vital. We're all aware of the transit infrastructure, the water infrastructure, the housing, and so on. But there has not been a linguistic portrait of any city as far as I know. And that involves going beyond the sort of the obvious, the signage, the major languages. When we talk about linguistic diversity, when we talk about the world's 7,000 plus languages, which are now being sort of squeezed into about 200 nation states, we're talking about primarily oral languages, indigenous, minority, and oral languages which are not well known to speakers of larger languages, and which are increasingly endangered, and which are very little documented, even by linguists. That half of the world's languages that are considered endangered now by linguists are also barely recorded, rarely even have a dictionary, a grammar. Only 5% of the world's languages are online in any meaningful sense, despite Google's claims to organize the world's information. So our work has been both to map and document the diversity of this place and understand what it means for a city to be so linguistically diverse at the very moment when that diversity is endangered for all sorts of reasons. Both because languages themselves are endangered, but also it gets us to questions about immigration, gentrification, changes in urban life, mobility, all kinds of things that I'm sure we'll touch on. So in addition to the mapping work, we have also done some in-depth work documenting many of the languages, as well as working with speakers who want to revitalize them, teach them, create children's books, a whole variety of things that we do at the Endangered Language Alliance that I talk about in the book. So the book is it's structured around the sort of past, present, and future of the world's most linguistically diverse city. And that includes both a history, which is divided into 4 parts, sort of roughly chronological, but also thematic, that traces both the original language of this place, ultimately, which is Lenape, and itself is a highly endangered language, down to really one native speaker in Canada, but now has a sort of group of revivalists, one of whom I profile and follow in the book, Karen, who brought the language back to New York to teach it really for the first time in several centuries. Through the sort of colonial founding exactly 400 years ago with Walloon-speaking refugees who came here, sort of setting the pattern of refugees and minority language speakers being the core to the history of the city. Through sort of 400 years of certainly various cycles, but essentially almost continuous immigration, fueling and powering the city in so many ways, I think to a unique degree globally, that has now become much more normal for cities in the last century or so. But the sort of the continuous immigration gateway role of the city is distinctive and informs most of really what is around us, I would argue. Then in terms of the sort of the present day and giving us a deeper dive, I profile 6 speakers of languages from different parts of the world, in very different kinds of situations, who are trying to defend their mother tongues and develop them in various ways, who I've worked with for years. And I try to really give a sense of the languages too, in terms of their linguistic structure and enabling, though the book is written in English, us to sort of hear and see the languages as well. And finally, the future. Where do we go from here? What does this mean? Is this peak diversity? We're in the 100th anniversary of the 1924 Immigration Act that closed America's doors for several decades, and there's a sort of a swell of anti-immigrant rhetoric, obviously, coming from certain circles that we can talk about, and even in just the last couple of weeks, Trump has started sort of railing about what he calls truly foreign languages, languages that nobody speaks, whatever that means, languages coming into our country, and actually a sort of English-only movement has been growing, which maybe has its prime target as Spanish, but actually is sort of targeting this extraordinary linguistic diversity which has come to this city above all, but really from here on out and beyond. So that's kind of the structure of it, and I hope you'll find you'll sort of hear the city in a different way, that it will bring the city into earshot, especially the sort of outer borough worlds of Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, where so much of the linguistic diversity is concentrated in many forms. But I'll just sort of leave it there and hope that you will plunge into parts of it here, but also that you enjoy the book and that it raises many new questions and helps you see and hear the city in a new way. So, Jordan, I'm excited to sort of have this conversation with you. Take it away.
I'm excited too.
And I should say thank you also to Housing Works for this liquid death. This is water, despite how it looks. Mountain water, they say. So, yeah.
Is this is working okay? Some people, I might just speak loudly, but they're gonna figure that out. In the meantime, I'm gonna speak loudly. One of the things that I like the most about your book is that, and as you've just described for us, it gives the macro portrait of kind of how all this fits together, but also it provides about 5 or 6 micro portraits of individuals. And that's in large part because of your work as the co-founder of the Endangered Language Alliance. And so how I want to start is I want to get a sense of how you got started with that organization and what the process looked like for creating that amazing map that's online. How did you get to the kind of base starting point to say, okay, we have this presentable map that people can literally zoom into and see in what block people speak specific languages?
Well, maybe to start with sort of language mapping for a second, I should say that, language mapping is kind of its own strange art form, right? How do you map a language? A language moves in the mouth of its speaker. So many New Yorkers are highly multilingual. Half of all New Yorkers speak a language other than English at home. And as I said, there are over 700 languages represented here, and that there are many others, surely, that we don't know about. We use the approach of significant sites, right? Religious institutions, hometown associations are particularly vital, and I talk about them in the book. There are thousands of these that go under different names in different languages. In Italian, it might be società. In Yiddish, it's Landsmannschaft. It might just be a klub in Spanish, hemşehrilik in Turkish or Ladino. So these are institutions which reflect the very specific hometowns and home regions, Kiduk in Tibetan, Samaj in South Asian languages, that people are coming from when they come here. Because migration to this city, and migration globally really, but in New York it's really exemplified, it's not about people sort of from one nation coming to another nation. That really is sort of an official statistical way of looking at it. It's about these sort of deeply translocal connections between a particular town or village or region and even a particular neighborhood or block or building here. And those are the sort of ties. It's families, it's kin, it's people who know each other. This is how movement and mobility are happening. And language is the sort of lens for understanding it, particularly because speakers of less common languages have always been represented here in the city. They've had the most incentive to move in many cases. So it's actually, to sort of look and say, so-and-so is from Mexico, they must just be a Spanish speaker, is to miss the fact that indigenous Mexican languages are actually 3 times overrepresented here versus what it is in Mexico, because something like 70-80% of all Mexican New Yorkers are coming from a couple of southern states in Mexico, Puebla and Guerrero especially. So understanding these exact sort of the true sister cities of New York, and again, this can be generalized to other cities as well, is a vital thing that we've tried to map. And actually, if you go to the Delta terminal at LaGuardia, we collaborated with this artist Mariam Ghani, who did there a sort of a kind of rendering of our language map that then showed these sort of flight paths connecting different parts of New York to very different particular places around the world where people are actually coming from, the sort of true sister cities. In terms of how I got into this stuff, so I'm born and raised in New York, but really as a monolingual English speaker. I talk about it in the book. There were languages in my family's past, especially Yiddish was sort of the lost language, but also Polish and Russian and German were also part of the multilingual mix, going back to my great-grandmother who came through Ellis Island at the age of 16, speaking all those languages without any formal education. Would be called an unaccompanied minor today, probably, but was coming looking for her brother. And basically my family never really left the archipelago after coming through Ellis Island. So as it is for Jordan, and as you can read in his book, I mean, migration is a deeply kind of personal question, and I think it's deeply integral to the history of the city and this whole land and really the world. But there was a sort of longing for the other languages. There was a desire to sort of grapple with the multilingual city that I understood was all around me. I didn't understand at that point that we were talking about the most linguistically diverse city in the world. And it really took living in China and beginning to study Mandarin and meeting a Chinese linguist, as I talk about briefly in the introduction, to understand that there was this situation of global language loss, that half of the world's 7,000 languages may be likely to disappear. And then to sort of, after several years there, doing a PhD working on one particular language in this sort of spirit of language documentation, sort of traditional field work, working on a dictionary and a grammar and a series of recordings of stories and conversations with speakers of a language called Turung in one Himalayan valley, that I sort of came back to New York, where the Endangered Language Alliance had just been founded by a group of linguists, a poet, and artist, or a variety of New Yorkers, language activists, with this recognition, with this idea that there's a unique opportunity here in this city at this moment, with speakers of endangered languages arriving here, coming here, and actually being a subway ride away rather than 7,000 miles away. That actually, linguistic diversity is not all on sort of distant mountains or islands, that it's actually right here where we are. And so really that's become the sort of the guiding light since then, and sort of turning that lens onto the city, understanding cities as these sort of hotbeds of linguistic diversity, but can they be greenhouses and not graveyards for languages is the question, because so often the diversity is here, but we don't even know it's here, and it just sort of, it runs through like a sieve. So many of the skills and knowledge and wisdom that is brought here along with the languages is then lost. So the question is, can we hold it? Can we build something for it? Can we, take advantage of this moment?
There's a lot in there that I want to unpack, but I want to go back to something that you said a little bit earlier, which was about translocal as opposed to necessarily thinking about transnational migration, but thinking about translocal migrations, and how perhaps an entire, apartment building could contain members of one community, one specific town, for example, in another place. And that language map that you were talking about, the one in LaGuardia, the artwork, we talked about this the first time that we spoke on the phone, but that in reporting on migration and speaking with a group of Quechua-speaking indigenous immigrants from Ecuador, people would post videos on TikTok of themselves arriving at LaGuardia in front of the very mosaic that Ross's organization helped to create. And then that meant that people back in Ecuador also associated New York with that mosaic. So anyway, all to say that this is also in very small ways, but also in very large and multinational and international ways, creating these maps of New York in other places where people have intimate knowledge of the streets and the neighborhoods of this city just because their family members are here. And I was wondering if that's been your experience too, that you found that.
There's a lot more we could say about these translocal ties. People may be familiar already with remittance economies and the deep economic impact of money that is being sent back by people working here to their home communities. This plays a powerful economic role in much of the world. In terms of the demographics as well, what often is happening now is that entire villages, entire towns, entire communities are sort of emptying out and coming here or to other places as well. And then there is a back and forth though in terms of the those who remain, in terms of the language, in terms of the culture, in terms of the food, in terms of the ideas, in terms of the politics. There are very deep impacts. And part of what Jordan is alluding to is his just tremendous piece from last year, I think, called "The Candy Sellers" in New York Magazine, which I think is really one of the most well-reported and deep accounts of the current migration situation that is unfolding right now in the city, in which we can talk about has been, I think, very much mismanaged in certain ways, but does kind of reflect that this is still a fundamental sort of destination for people, right? And that there are fundamental questions about what kind of city we are going to be. The article gets into how many of the people you may have seen selling candy on the subway are in fact indigenous, are in fact speakers of Quechua, coming from particular places in Ecuador for particular historical reasons, that this is having particular impacts that go across borders. And so, it means many things, but among others, in terms of language, for us, it means that linguistic projects that you work on here, if we're able to work on a dictionary, as we talk about in the book, with a speaker here, or have a class for the first time in a language here, or work on a writing system, that can then sort of travel back to the homeland of the language. And in a few sections of the book, I go to Nepal and to Tajikistan with speakers of languages who are here. We go back to the home communities where there are still, it's essential to work with elders. It's essential to still kind of go to the places where the languages are originally from. But there are things that can be done sort of on both sides. And I guess the last point I'll make is just that this hopefully kind of enlarges and helps us rethink the whole notion of diaspora. And that we're in a sort of capital of diaspora or diasporas. Diasporas upon diasporas. And that really part of what's happening now is that almost every group is going through diaspora, is experiencing diaspora. What does that mean? What does that mean for the world? What is the notion of homeland that is there? What are the sort of the mobilities behind that? The unequal mobilities perhaps, because for some it's easier to travel than ever before. For others it's becoming harder and harder. But I think this will deeply, it gets to all the musics that have evolved here, the artistic forms that have evolved here have been sort of in the crucible of diaspora.
So here's what I want to ask you about that is, of the people who speak the rarest languages that you've documented in New York, people who speak a language, perhaps one of, between 1 and 10 speakers of a language or just a few more people, how do they see their own identity? So they think of themselves very quickly as New Yorkers or as Americans, or are they thinking of themselves almost unilaterally as the speaker of this language that's disappearing?
Well, there's so many different sort of identity frames that the speakers I profile in the book are sort of going through, because first of all, they're highly multilingual people. I may be focused in the book on their mother tongues. So kind of briefly, we're talking about a language called Seke from 5 villages of Nepal, spoken by approximately 700 people, of whom over 100 have come to a single vertical village, a single building in Brooklyn. And we're talking about Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, the largest indigenous language of Mexico, with an estimated 1.5 million speakers, but still very much kind of encircled by Spanish in many ways, but thousands of speakers now coming to New York. I talk about a writing system, Unko, that is spreading in West Africa, and now also Harlem and the Bronx. I talk about Yiddish, which is having a sort of revival of sorts in Hasidic Brooklyn, which is quite extraordinary, going into the sort of 4th or 5th generation. Now, even though among secular Yiddish speakers, essentially the language has been lost. And that, that sort of 4th, 5th generation, that would be, that's a highly unusual or even new situation, given the usual pattern of immigrant language loss that we were talking about. And I talk about Wakhi, a language from Tajikistan that is sort of riven by 4 borders, 4 national borders, Tajikistan, China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and is sort of forming one of the newest communities in the city. And then finally, Lenape. So, from all of these stories, there are 6 languages, but actually the individuals speak over 30 languages, as I counted them. So they have these just so many frames of identity that they're working within, that they have to work within for survival. In general, it's the most marginal people, the most marginalized, are actually the most multilingual because they have to be. And for somebody like Husnia, the Wakhi speaker I described, she is both Wakhi, she's also Pamiri, which is a sort of a larger identity within Tajikistan of a group of peoples. She's also in some sense Tajik. She's also very much connected to Russian, having been raised and born in the Soviet Union, essentially. She's also Muslim. In particular, she's Ismaili, which is a particular branch of Shia Islam. But she, on the streets, often gets mistaken for being somehow Latina or somehow Jewish. And so she's balancing sort of all of these identities. And part of understanding the city, a city like this, which is fundamentally in many ways patterned along ethno-linguistic lines, is how all of these identities are mobilized in different ways for, in the competition and the need for resources and survival in the city, right? How do people vote? How do people live? And part of what I look at are the sort of microcosms of whole parts of the world, which are now sort of shrunk down to, a single city neighborhood. How the languages of South Asia can be sort of shrunk down into Jackson Heights, or the languages of the former Soviet Union, all or largely represented in and around Brighton Beach, and what that means for the languages to be sort of rubbing up right against each other. So there are all these identities are sort of in play, and the least known perhaps is that of speaker of such and such endangered language. And yet that's the one where I think each of the speakers realizes if they don't do something about it, there's no one who will.
All of these identities being wrapped up in one human being and one person is, I think, something that a lot of people who live in the city and a lot of people who live in the United States feel. It's something that I'm sure a lot of people in the audience might feel. I wonder if people might raise their hands and give a sense of, if your family speaks multiple languages, or if you feel like you have competing or conflicting identities and don't know how to necessarily represent yourself in different contexts, do people have that experience, or know people who have that experience? Maybe it's less common than I'm thinking, but it's certainly something that you come across.
I'm sure there are many languages in this room, one way or another, in people's families and people's histories. As I say in the book, we all have a linguistic history, in ourselves and our families. And even within, we might think, oh, well, I'm just an English speaker, I'm just a Spanish speaker, but we're also in a sort of capital of Englishes and capital of Spanishes.
Right.
Nowhere else in the world are so many of those all kind of represented. And what does that mean for those all to be in contact with each other?
Right, and anyway, all this is to say is the point being is to describe ourselves with more nuance and more context is a big kind of thesis of the book, and point in the book is that it's important to lean into those, I guess, those pieces of ourselves that maybe don't come out at first glance.
Well, yeah, Jordan does this in a really kind of intricate and lovely way in this book. If I can sort of get it right, it's the idea of sort of like on the one side, Syrian, Argentine, Jewish background, right? On the other side, Iraqi Jewish background. But then sort of unpacking those terms of the languages involved is part of what I think Jordan does beautifully here.
Well, because when I read your book, I saw remnants of my own family that speaks an endangered language.
Yeah.
And I'm the generation that's going to lose Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic, which is a Jewish dialect of Iraqi Arabic. And so my question for you in that sense is the non-trend, because we're talking here about the guardians of languages and the people who move it forward. But what I want to know is how these languages are so easily lost. And what are some of the reasons why, especially in the United States, a language could disappear so quickly?
So what is driving language loss and language shift now? This is a fundamental question that at least the sort of branch of linguistics that I'm connected with is trying to grapple with. People will say, languages have always come and gone, right? People will always say, oh, Latin, isn't that gone? Actually it's still kind of here in interesting ways, but yes, it's true that languages have always come and gone. It's true that there are even a few sort of new languages emerging, and whether they sort of remain stable as languages is a question. But here, even in New York, as I talk about in the book, there are sort of interesting forms of language mixing which are kind of uniquely coming up. One I talk about is sometimes called Ramaluk. It's really more of a set of practices than a single thing that you can pin down. You might compare it to what's popularly called Spanglish, but really, again, is a highly variable set of different creative practices. In the case of Ramaluk, it's the mixing of Tibetan, Nepali, other Himalayan languages, depending on the context. That's happening, above all in places like Jackson Heights and Woodside, actually. So yes, there are sort of new languages that may be coming up in certain ways. Languages have always come and gone. But what's happening now and what's happened in the last just sort of century or two is an unprecedented situation of loss. And it can be compared and has been compared with the loss of biodiversity as well. And there are close connections in terms of where languages are, where biodiversity is. We could talk more about that. It's complicated. Languages are not species, but at the same time, there are some suggestive connections. And really, we're talking about events that have been unfolding over the last few centuries that are connected to the spread of empires, to the spread of colonialism, to the spread of capitalism, to now the spread of nation states, to mass media, mass education. And sure, we can say that some of those processes are positive and have uplifted some languages, but it comes back to the dynamic I alluded to earlier, which is that you have over 7,000 languages sort of being squeezed into 200 nation states, and most of those nation states really wanting to impose a single or maybe at most a few languages, and not even much variety within that, a sort of standard version there. And so the types of kind of natural, the linguistic ecologies of sort of deep multilingualism and variation, even from locality to locality, are really being swept away. And the way that it manifests then as well is kind of in terms of like internalized shame and even the sort of rhetoric that these are not real languages, they're just dialects. If they're not written, they're not substantial. If they don't have a word for iPhone, they must not be modern. I think it's better if they don't have a word for iPhone. But in truth, from a linguistic point of view, there's something called the principle of linguistic equality, which is that really all languages as spoken by native speakers are fundamentally cognitively and communicatively equal. There's no sense in which the grammar of one is more sophisticated than the grammar of another. There's no sense in which any language is broken if it's a native language. And words can be borrowed, and always are. It's been estimated that even of the English that we speak, only sort of 30% of the vocabulary is really sort of Old English, core English, and vast amounts have come basically through French and Latin and Greek, and so on, and many other languages. There are ways that languages can be developed and are developed given the proper support, and if people have the ability to sort of determine their own linguistic futures outside of a context of, in some cases, languages literally be made illegal by governments that may fear them or associate them with rebel movements or anything like that. It's a conjunction of factors which is leading to language loss, and then it's really about intergenerational transmission at the end of the day, whether parents, grandparents, caregivers are passing on the language. And under normal circumstances where people, are not under these pressures, of course there are always going to be certain economic incentives for certain languages and so on, and there may be a lingua franca which is useful to learn for doing trade or getting a job. But the idea that everybody has to sort of converge on not even necessarily just English, but on Spanish or Bengali or Tokpisin or whatever, that's
right?
what have been sometimes called killer languages. And of course, we're not personifying languages exactly, but it's the pressure is, if you took that away, people would pass on their native language, multilingualism could operate. And then the question is, how does this operate here at the level of New York? It's not just English, actually. Again, it's people feeling that they need to shift to Spanish if they're speakers of indigenous languages, or that they need to switch to Nepali if they're speakers of Himalayan languages, or Russian if they're speakers of Central Asian languages. So the city has many lingua francas. And the question is what kind of environment can be developed where people can determine their linguistic futures?
New York is already, in many ways, a Latin American city, a new Latin American city, but one of the things in your book that comes out very true is that this is actually becoming an indigenous Latin American capital of the world. So that's just a side note to this point of these languages that kind of usurp others. But should we learn languages that are no longer functionally extinct, if we're talking about in the terms of biodiversity? Should I learn a language that I can no longer have anybody to speak with? And why? If the answer is yes, we know this.
It's one of the hardest things you can do if you want a serious kind of intellectual and emotional challenge. To learn a less common language. I don't know if anybody has done that, but something that's not on Duolingo, something where there is no dictionary. This is essentially what linguists do, or what we have to do when we're working with a speaker of a language that hasn't been documented, is to sort of learn it from them patiently, where they are essentially the teacher. There are no textbooks. There's no roadmap necessarily. You're learning it through the process of spending time with them and of sort of eliciting it from them in various ways. I've taught a class which a number of linguists will teach at their schools called linguistic field methods, where you essentially are showing students how to do this, working directly with a speaker, this is the process. But that said, it raises all kinds of interesting challenges, right? And you have to look at every situation kind of in its own context. A language, as I talk about it in the book, can be seen as an index of time spent with people. In many cases, it's not what we think of perhaps today as like a code that AI can just kind of swallow and spit out. This is not like sort of cracking a code, and I kind of describe a little bit my own evolution in thinking about language. That just as the world is not, languages don't name exactly the same world. It's not like you just change the label on things. That actually languages cut the world in different ways and see it in different ways. We can talk more about what that means in terms of culture or worldview. There's a lot of complexities there, but essentially each language is doing something quite different in the way it understands the world. It's emerging out of a particular context and history and indeed ecology of wherever the language originates, which of course can be developed and in diaspora in different places through mobility. To learn all that, in most cases, what it meant and what it means to know a language is that you are part of a community, and or that you've spent a great deal of time there, that you care about it, that you're invested in it. There is a world now of polyglots who are learning languages online and through resources online, and it's fascinating, it's beautiful. There's a lot there. But I think fundamentally with most of the languages that we're talking about in this book and most of kind of human history, it's about spending time with people. It's about where you are and how you are. So I would say, look at the languages around you, look at who you are, your communities, where who what the situation is. And that there are many ways also to be a speaker. There's a whole kind of range of possibilities of speakerhood as well. That some idea of fluency is a moving target, and actually just a term in English. Actually, there's many ways of talking about this in different languages.
Say a bit more about that, because I want to know what does it mean to have a moving target as fluency? Because are we aiming too high in terms of what we think it means to be fluent in a language? What does that look like to actually in the process, especially if it's a language that we hold in our family heritage, let's say.
Well, there's one of the terms that's now emerged is heritage speaker, right? Speaker of a heritage language, which means the language is in your past, it's in your family. You may know some words of it, you may have some sense of it, but there's a sort of growing sensitivity to and awareness of all the sort of different levels of speakerhood which are possible, and which have always been possible, perhaps, but perhaps never more so than now, given all of the language shift and all the changes that are happening. People may be sort of rememberers, semi-speakers. They may, you may be, of course, there's differences between a second language and a third language and so on, and the context in which you've learned a language. So I think that, I also talk about this sort of world of more symbolic and post-vernacular language use, which I think there's a lot to do with technology here as well. The idea that actually, as some of our work and other linguists and language activists, archiving and documenting languages, trying to make them more available online and elsewhere, allows people the possibility to revive languages in the future. And this is starting to happen. We're also kind of entering a golden age of language revitalization, really nowhere more so than with Native American languages, where there have been some extraordinary stories of languages that are being brought back after more than a century. So these all kind of raise different questions about what it means to speak a language. And for many people, even if there's a single song or a single prayer or a few words that they know, that also can be extremely meaningful and needs to be acknowledged. So, I guess there are some exciting possibilities. I don't think we need to be completely constrained. Certainly the idea of a language as a sort of daily practice, constant vernacular that is spoken sort of natively and learned before what's been called the critical period, which is sort of that era, that time in early childhood where the brain is particularly plastic and can sort of pick up languages. That is still for many a sort of gold standard of maintaining a language, but there are many other models too, and there are perhaps more than ever sort of different linguistic afterlives which are possible and may allow us to sort of retain and develop linguistic diversity in new and exciting ways.
this is going to be my last question before I open it up to questions from the audience, but what does it look like to make New York a friendlier city for languages, for that linguistic infrastructure that you mentioned at the beginning, and what we're talking about now in a lot of ways, people learning languages and also not losing the languages that our families already speak?
I think this, it's a sort of a unique moment where we can embrace the challenge of being the most multilingual city in history, or we can sort of let it slip through our fingers. I think part of what finally prompted me to write the book after a number of years of just doing the work was the height of COVID, where we shifted almost kind of overnight. We had done a little of this work before, but from generally sort of more work directly around language and documentation of languages and revitalization of languages to translation, interpretation, access to information, work in hospitals, making connections between city agencies, and in what was a sort of life or death situation for many, right? Because if you didn't hear about social distancing and things like that, which are incredibly hard to translate and almost sort of bizarre even in English, if you heard about something on March 10th versus March 15th, and the way the information was transmitted and how much information there was, aside from all the other connections between language and health and education, which have been substantiated in recent years, it became clear that it's actually a sort of a life or death matter. And this sort of new, extraordinary indigenous city that Jordan alluded to that has grown up here, where there are now more indigenous languages of the Americas represented here than really in any other place. Those are spoken by the people who are the essential workers, who are delivering food, who are cooking food, who are, have been sort of on the front lines of so much of this, and have been among the most vulnerable. So language is not just a sort of, this is nice if one speaks this language or not. It can be a matter of life and death. And interpretation, translation, language access, language barriers, these are commonly cited as some of the biggest things that people are dealing with. Just in the last few decades, New York has started to be a leader, and maybe the leader, in terms of language policy, which is almost an invisible domain in this country at the sort of federal level. And so there now are certain policies that, there are 10 so-called citywide languages. These are all spoken by around 100,000 people. Haitian
Do you know
Creole.
off the top of your head? What
Yeah,
are the
we could
10
quickly
cities?
sort of,
Yeah.
there some of them are ambiguous, like Chinese, quote unquote, which kind of is seen to include both Mandarin, Cantonese, and maybe Taiwanese, which is, also called Fujianese, depending on where people are coming from. But as well as Spanish, certainly Russian, Bengali, Haitian Creole, Arabic, Urdu. There's a few that are sort of in contention or that are used for certain things. And then there's a raft of policies at the level of different city agencies, which are supposed to have language access plans and language access coordinators. It's not a lot. It's just a sort of a beginning, but it is, New York is trying to sort of lead. There's sort of fledgling efforts. And then there's the whole world of education, which is a crucial one, the bilingual education world. There are now programs in 13 languages at different schools. The vast majority are in Spanish and forms of Chinese, but so a lot has come, but it's actually just the sort of beginnings of really what I think a true linguistic infrastructure for the city would look like. Which, I don't think it's not a matter of having every sign translated into 700 languages, and it's not necessarily a matter of huge expenditures. It's a matter of being aware that the languages are here in the first place, when the census captures only a fifth, really, of what our language map has been showing. Knowing that they're here in the first place, having that sort of awareness, and then really the right kinds of interventions at the right moments that just sort of encourage and celebrate, and then actually in the sort of key domains have the sort of translation and interpretation and other sort of key things in place. So this is part of what we're working towards at the Endangered Language Alliance. I hope the book and the map and these things sort of go towards it, and that this is something you guys will take away from this as well. But it is a massive project of attention and of care, I think, and of opening our ears to what is really all around us, but at this point still remains largely inaudible to most of us.
With that, I want to open it up to see if you guys have one on board.
So I was fascinated by your describing how much time it takes for obligation that you have once you've learned that language and that speaker has so few people to share it with?
What is the ethical obligation once you've learned a less common language? Yeah, it's, thank you for that question. You know, in the sense that anytime you have learned a language that, you know, the kinds of languages we're talking about that can't be learned from Duolingo, it's a testament to the time that a speaker has spent with you. And I'm just on even a surface level, you know, we're always finding any way we can to pay for that time as well, that this is a job, that there should be pay for it, that the people who I talk about in the book are already working multiple jobs, are already working long hours, that they should be sort of fully acknowledged, that they should have a central role in determining how all of it's used. It's also a labor of love, and I think it implies an ongoing relationship. And I guess this is a sort of crucial dimension of what does field work mean in the city, I guess, to use the word field work, which you know, it's similar in some ways to what anthropologists do, what I did for my, you know, PhD field work. You're going to a distant place, you're living there, you're there for a long time, but then generally you leave, you come back. And sure, it may be easier to some extent now to keep in touch through, you know, various means, but part of what I think makes the work powerful in the city is that you're doing it as neighbors over the long run, and the relationships are ongoing. The horizon is open. You know, our organization, we're a shoestring in many ways, and there's many constraints on all of this, but fundamentally the idea is of linguists, communities, language activists, ordinary New Yorkers working in partnership for the long run.
Any other questions? No?
Yeah, all right.
Sure.
It's like, check out my glasses.
I'm first generation Italian American. I speak Italian. My mother spoke to me, she's from Sicily, my father's from Rome. And I speak Italian, but I speak a standardized Italian. She didn't want us to learn the dialect. So, you know, of course they speak Dante Alighieri, you know, just like William Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm.
But all of this is written down. And the American Indians, you know, they recognize 254 tribes, but there's really around 3,500. And they have spotty places where they're putting together the phonetics and the alphabet. Otherwise, it's going to be lost. So, and I realize that there's not a lot of you guys, you know, because beyond archaeology, there's linguistics, and then there's DNA. So, so is there any sort of, because, you know, our myth here, like in Greece, you know, in Rome, it's like the gods and, you know, but here our myth is the American Indian. You know, we make statues to them and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to preserve that language. So do you know how many languages are being saved?
Thank you for that. So just briefly first about Italian, thank you for sharing that, because, you know, I in terms of the history of the city, you know, this is often talked about as one of the most Italian cities outside of Italy, but what does Italian mean in this case, linguistically speaking? The extraordinary linguistic diversity of the Italian peninsula has, you know, variation from, in many cases, from town to town. And the so-called dialetti, or, you know, the dialects, are in fact really, from a linguistic point of view, you know, can be just as much languages, and there's not always mutual intelligibility, even though now, of course, you know, the Italian national language has spread. When most Italian New Yorkers came in the sort of largest wave in the late 19th, early 20th century, only a small percentage would have been speakers of Standard Time. They would have been speakers largely, again, coming from particular places in Sicily, in Calabria, in Abruzzo, and so on. So it's a classic story, and I try to capture a little bit of it, but it's, again, it speaks to all that's happening now. In terms of Native American languages, you know, it's a complicated story in many regards. There's, you know, an estimate that north of the Rio Grande, there were approximately 300 languages spoken at the time of initial European colonization. Of those, more than half are gone, and there may be sort of records of them, but and there may be chances and prospects for revitalization. Somebody has counted, a large number of language revitalization programs, but for many, there's just a word list, a few words. In terms of those that remain, only a small number are actively being transmitted to children, right? You'll have a language like Central Yupik in Alaska, which is in a relatively remote setting and has not been subject to the pressures for as long. There's still some transmission. Even with Navajo, Diné, which is the largest in terms of the number of speakers, supposedly, there's challenges around transmission, serious challenges. So no Native American language can really be considered safe. And I talk about the situation with Lenape, which is, a single native speaker, essentially, who's in Canada at this point. And then many people trying to revive it, but that challenge again. So, there's a little bit of funding for this. Not a lot, not nearly as much as there needs to be, given, as you say, the central kind of status and importance of Native American languages for this land. Of course, many native place names remain, starting with Manhattan. I talk about in the book a Lenape word, but not nearly enough is being done. And certainly, there's other information from archaeology, from genetics, and things that can help us kind of, triangulate and understand that history. But the languages are central, and you'll hear it again and again from tribal language activists, and there are many now tribal linguists as well. We're trying to do this in their settings, but it's language endangerment it's not a problem of faraway places. It's actually at its most kind of dire, perhaps, in places like the U.S. and Australia. And there are many languages, especially on the West Coast, not just Lenape, that are really down to sort of one or two speakers, essentially. Again, there may be different levels of speakerhood. There may be others who remember something, and there may be people who are trying to revive it. But this is not, this is pressing. This is now. This is here.
So these Native American languages where there's few speakers left, is it even possible to preserve the language? I mean, are we just presenting a fraction of it? Hasn't much of that vocabulary already been lost?
Right. What does it mean to document a language when it's at that kind of stage? I think that's right in many respects. Imagine if anybody in this room, if you were considered to be, one of the last speakers of a particular language, and it was based entirely, a grammar and a dictionary was based entirely on your knowledge. Well, you know more than you think. I mean, we actually are all sort of extraordinary kind of walking dictionaries, and if a linguist worked with you for many years and you were very patient and so on, we could probably get several thousand words out of you, but and much more. But yes, I think it's true that you really we could talk about what does it even mean to document a language in all of its fluidity. It's similar to the question of how do you map a language, right? Languages are always changing. There's variation. There's all kinds of questions. And given sort of different frequencies of words and grammatical elements, I mean, some words, we only say every 10 years it comes up once, right? So, ideally for sort of true language documentation, you want a language that is still being that's fully functional in terms of its spheres of use, in terms of speakers of different ages, genders, backgrounds. You can sort of see it in all kinds of settings, natural settings where it's really being used very actively. So it's true that once it gets to that stage, I mean, the state of documentation for Native American languages is a little bit better. I mean, there was work in many cases several decades ago. The least documented languages in the world now generally are in more far-flung places, the languages of different parts of Central Africa or Papua New Guinea and so on. But it's you have to sort of do it when you can, and it's not ideal for the idea, that one linguist working with one or a few speakers, that's a very poor partial record for sure. But anything is better than nothing, I guess. And there's no real, saving a language, I guess, is also, we need to be sort of mindful that there is no sort of saving, and there's no kind of, there is the attempt to sort of witness and document and take a snapshot and do what you can working with speakers. Certainly the idea that, okay, there's a book, there's something, there's an archive that's meaningful, but again, it's if we can imagine all the possibilities of sort of developing all of our languages and what that would mean in terms of the richness of human culture, we're far from it.
So I have a follow-up question. So if we're lucky enough to be part of a community that still speaks one of these rare but unwritten languages that are dying off, how would you recommend for the community to try to document the language without being able to pass it on to
So yeah, documentation we consider often is sort of a first step towards, it's distinct from the idea of it, that it has to be transmitted or reviving it, at least to document it so that there's a record of it that potentially future generations and others can use is a key first step, and that is where linguists are sort of can play a role, that there is sort of specific training and knowledge and tools. We talk in terms of sort of dictionary work, a grammar, a corpus of texts that's hopefully representative in various ways of the different domains of a language, different kinds of speakers. Those are often sort of three initial pillars that a community working with linguists will try to tackle. It depends on the situation. In many cases, there might be some partial documentation of a language or of one particular variety or of certain things. It really varies depending on the language. I try to sort of describe this in the book where, there may be a genre of song or a type of storytelling or certain kinds of proverbs or certain grammatical or lexical, domains that are particularly kind of distinctive in a language. It's been said that every language has its genius, which, could mean different things, but essentially is that you sort of get to the sort of what the language is really doing and what needs to be kind of documented and understood. And certainly speakers and members of communities themselves are often in the best position as being sort of closest to it. But then hopefully those sort of connections with linguists and with others, to help sort of build that out. And then those questions of transmission and actual speaking, those often demand other kinds of solutions around, these days it's often connected with writing and classes and, creating spaces for the languages, textbooks, children's books, videos, all of the kinds of things that help a language feel like it has a whole sort of armature, right, that people can, that speakers can be part of.
Last question, briefly.
I was just hoping to speak on the intersection of language preservation, documentation, repetition, evolution, as it relates to technological advancements, especially as large language models and natural language processing is advancing, especially as it comes to person through dialects and accents and all of that. And how are you guys using that in language activism?
The role of technology, yeah, it's a big question. I talk about it in various ways in the book. Technology enables a lot of what we do, even just, to sort of having great recorders and the internet as a place to archive and distribute and so on. In all kinds of ways, we rely on technology, and technology is hugely useful, even as it also kind of cuts the other way, right? And as you can imagine, most technologies themselves only being available in a few languages or pulling people towards larger languages or giving the feeling that smaller languages have to catch up. So technology can cut both ways depending on, and I talk about how, like voice messages can actually be a great technology for people because they bypass all the issues around, going from an oral language to a written language. So I try to get into some of these complexities, and now, with AI, large language models, it's in each case, it's kind of like, well, maybe it will open up sort of new linguistic afterlives in some cases, right? If you can go into a VR or AR setting and speak to an elder or even, experience a language that has been, is no longer being spoken. There are some promising things, but it sort of depends on who is controlling the technology, right? And how it's being designed and who has access to it. All of those are key questions. I try to tackle this partly in the book through the story of Ibrahima, who originally from Guinea, moved to the Lower East Side about 30 years ago, Harlem and the Lower East Side. And as I mentioned, has been kind of teaching, has been the first person to sort of bring to the U.S. really one of the first Mko, this relatively new writing system from West Africa, developed in the 1940s. West Africa has actually been a hotbed of new writing systems in the last 2 centuries. And writing itself is a technology, we should say. And then certainly the ability, he's been working on also getting it into Unicode so it can be represented on digital devices, and then fonts and websites and making sure that it's supported in different kinds of software. Each thing is often a battle because most of these languages are not sort of commercial interest to the big tech companies. So technology cuts in all sorts of different directions. There's exciting things about it that we're trying to kind of make the most of with speakers. It represents a whole new set of domains for these languages to be able to be part of. And to have somebody making a video in the middle of Times Square in their language and sort of beaming it back to the village or town where they're from can mean a lot. But I don't know that it's a substitute for that time spent with people. I don't think it really is. That ultimately is what kind of keeps languages going. It's ultimately often even just one relationship with a parent, a grandparent, a close friend, where the language is used, where the language is living, that really keeps a language going.
With that, I think we're going to end it. Thank you so much, Ross, and to the organizers.